Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here to review a 2008 film called Deception. And really, I think for me, I might have to do a little skating around within this movie. Because reasonably, this movie does tie into quite a bit of sex, or really just it just has a plethora. It's mostly tied into a giant uh, montage, but still, there's quite a bit of sex within this movie, or there's just kind of a lot of playing around with it, or stuff along those lines within this movie. But I think there is also a lot of other things besides that in this movie, and so I think I can kind of easily skirt around it because most of this movie is just a bulk of it, just like these kind of consistent scenes over and over and over again, where I can kind of skirt around some things and talk about this a certain way. Really, I kind of found it kind of fascinating because this movie was done with Hugh Jackman in it, and so that's kind of what got me interested. I think right about around the time that I ended up seeing a movie Swordfish, I just kind of tried to look into any Hugh Jackman films during that point in time, and so I ended up just kind of stumbling upon this movie. I'm like, what the heck is this film? And so I ended up watching it, and I'm like, you know what, like there's something about this film that I really did enjoy. Something as simple as, especially having Ewan McGregor's kind of innocence in this movie, where we end up having Jonathan McQuarrie, who is Ewan McGregor's character, and Hugh Jackman's Wyatt Bose's character. We end up having eventually these two people meet together while supposedly working in this lawyer firm place. We end up having Jonathan, who is an accountant, me and having Wyatt, who is just a lawyer there. It seems that Jonathan had to like seemingly be built from a poor home to eventually trying to scratch and claw to be able to get where he is, whereas Wyatt has kind of been like spoon fed, like silver spoon fed his way through his life, kind of uh, making it from a great college to come here and be a lawyer in this location. So while these two are consistently like talking it out at their workplace, we end up having these guys really hitting it off to where eventually uh, we have it to where it seems like they are together so often that eventually they end up accidentally picking up the wrong phones. And so, because they end up kind of dropping both their phones on this table, and once they go to pick their phones up, they end up going and, uh, of course, getting one another's incorrect phone. And so we eventually have it to where all of a sudden Jonathan is starting to get a bunch of calls from all these women that he does not know. And so we end up having, of course, having Jonathan calling Wyatt and saying, like, hey, buddy, like, it looks like you have my phone. Well, so we end up eventually having Wyatt getting back to him and is like, well, hey, like, did I get any messages? Like, hey, I've been kind of forwarding all of my stuff to this phone here, so no problems. So we end up having Jonathan, who ends up consistently getting these calls from all these uh, beautiful women, asking him if he is free tonight. To where we eventually find out what free tonight really means. Do you want to go and sleep together in some hotel? And so we end up having eventually where Jonathan is kind of mentioning that this isn't Wyatt Bose's phone and that you've reached the wrong guy. And eventually, this woman eventually wants to just have him uh, and meet Jonathan's character regardless. So we have Jonathan going along with it, and eventually we have Jonathan who ends up going along with this woman just wanting to ravish Jonathan into this hotel. And eventually we end up having Jonathan who's like, yeah, like I got one of your phone calls, and what the heck was that? To where eventually, like, yeah, we have it to where we are to find out that it seemed that Wyatt was attached to a SEX club, which is to basically just have a bunch of people call a bunch of random phone numbers to eventually ask someone, are they free tonight, for them to be able to go and get off, so to speak. So, besides that, we eventually have this story not quite ending there. That eventually, like, Jonathan is experimenting and whatever, but eventually we end up finding out that it seems that there is a whole reason for this story being the way it is. And so we eventually have it to where Wyatt is to eventually have Jonathan find out. It's like, well, everything that Wyatt was doing with Jonathan was just foreplay, and eventually Wyatt at some point will F Jonathan over, and eventually that will come somewhere in this movie. To where Jonathan will find out that it seems that Wyatt has lied about a lot of things. Wyatt is been a person that has consistently fabricated a lot of things, and eventually we will find out that Wyatt has a whole plan plotted out for Jonathan to forcibly do because Wyatt has been tracking this guy and trying to figure out how exactly he can use this guy to be able to manipulate him to do what Wyatt wants. And we'll also find out that Wyatt isn't actually Wyatt's name, that he has a separate name altogether. So Wyatt has lied about everything. Every little thing that he will have said or whatever will all be a lie, justifiably. Um, but yeah, Hugh Jackman had produced this film. It seems like like, I'm kind of wondering about this film more so than others. Like, why would Hugh Jackman want to do this kind of film? Um, because more than likely, maybe he's just like, well, like, who could deny not wanting to do this kind of film? Plus, like, I like the fact that we end up having Jonathan, who seems all good and innocent, and like he just wanted to, like, you could just tell that he wanted something out of his life. We end up having him kind of complain. We end up having him mention a lot where it just seems like he is just kind of just passing through his life, and we end up having it to where like nobody really sees Jonathan. Nobody really like, if anything, people would see Jonathan and want him out of their life as quickly as possible, because Jonathan is just there to come into any kind of business and do their accounting and crunch their numbers and see if anything at some point that they had messed up or did the numbers wrong at any portion of this company. And so Jonathan has to kind of come in to just kind of double check all the numbers on all the companies and make sure that they're not doing something illegal or doing something under the table. So yeah, really, I just love the innocence of Jonathan, and then eventually we end up just kind of seeing him getting worked over. Like, to me, like, I could almost see this eventually like turning out to eventually being like almost a Fight Club scenario, to where we are to eventually like have towards some portion of this movie to have both Wyatt Bowes and Jonathan McQuarrie being the same person, and we could have it to where Jonathan is actually just lost his freaking mind because of just the desperation that this guy has gone into. So where he is so utterly desperate to just want to be with a woman that his body and mind had just taken over, to where eventually we could have had it the whole time. This movie could have been done a different way and could have made it to be that Jonathan was just losing his mind, and like we could have had this movie kind of catered and tailored or whatever a different way. Then we would, because we almost get to see almost at some point Jonathan almost turning into Wyatt Bowes. So that's all I wanted to mention, a very cryptic like sense of this movie. um yeah, I honestly would have loved if we would have just found out, like, that would have been the big spin of this movie, to just find out that Jonathan was just insane this whole entire time. And it's just like a lot of stuff was weighing on Jonathan, and a lot of stuff that he just couldn't really be a part of anyone's life, so he made his own life for himself to finally just get with women, to whichever. We could have had this story broke down in any number of ways. But with that said, I am going to go into that coveted double five timed territory, so that way we can go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, like I had said, we end up having Jonathan, who is going and crunching the numbers and doing some accounting, seemingly by this lawyer firm. We end up having Wyatt Bowes, who ends up poking his head to let Jonathan know it's like, well, yeah, like just letting you know, it's like 10:30 at night or whatever. And so we end up having Wyatt, who's kind of just confused on how hard this guy's working and how late he's working. And so we eventually have it to where it seems that Jonathan and Wyatt are kind of kicking it off. It seems like Wyatt is a nice enough guy. So we end up having Wyatt, who ends up kind of popping out a thing of weed for both Jonathan and Wyatt to smoke. Basically, Wyatt is to mention that after they are to smoke this, then they'll be able to work even harder. So we have it to where they start to smoke this weed, and we end up having Jonathan, who ends up mentioning that really he's just a fixture at every single place that he goes. How really he can't meet anyone while he's working, because reasonably people see him as a temporary thing. Um, and like he can't really meet people, he can't make friends, he can't have a girlfriend, and all kinds of things, all kinds of problems. And so we end up having Jonathan just blah 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 blah. And we end up having Wyatt Bowes, who ends up mentioning it's like, dude, you've been talking for like 37 minutes straight. So eventually having both of these characters having the weed giggles, and we end up having like White, who is trying to uh, mention this joke, and it ends up getting to the point of like Wyatt can no longer remember the finishing part of this joke, to where they end up just both laughing at this joke that is, I guess, unfinished, and then just having a grand old time. So we push on to eventually have it to where Jonathan is to go to a subway station, and we end up having some blonde haired girl who is to ask him, hey, is this the right train to get to blah 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 place? And we end up having Jonathan, who's like, well, yep. So we end up having seemingly Jonathan notice this girl and kind of is attracted to her. And it seems that he ends up noticing that there is an S on her purse. So we end up having this girl who is to go off onto the subway. We end up having Jonathan kind of tempted to follow her, but he doesn't go along with it. Blah 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 blah. So we go on. So we are to continue to have Wyatt consistently bumping into Jonathan. We end up having eventually that uh, Jonathan is to bump into Wyatt, where Wyatt is going to ask Jonathan, like, "Hey, have you ever played tennis?" And so we end up having Jonathan and Wyatt going with these two random girls to play doubles with tennis. We end up having it to where it seems that Jonathan is a little bit like rusty with tennis, but it seems that he has his own tennis racket. So we end up having it to where Wyatt is just creaming Jonathan in tennis, and so we end up having it to where Jonathan is, or we have it to where Wyatt is looking at Jonathan's racket and like, what kind of racket is that? And we end up having Jonathan mentioning it's like, well, it's like a weave of like Kevlar and like something else, and so we end up having to eventually. Wyatt is thinking about getting a new racket, a different racket, because it's kind of like a really old racket. So moving on. So we we have it to where we are to see these guys consistently just like having chats and lunches and whatever, and we eventually have it to where both of them are to put their phones down on this table, and we end up having both retrieving their phones. So we end up immediately have Jonathan who ends up answering uh, a phone call that isn't actually of his, and so we end up having Jonathan then realize that we have the wrong phone numbers, and Wyatt is off to I think London to do something there. So oh, we also have it at some point to where Wyatt and Jonathan are to before they trade off phones. We end up having at one point where to where Wyatt takes Jonathan to eventually his apartment building where he is to talk about some painting, and we end up having also uh, Wyatt taking Jonathan out to a club where he is to tell Jonathan that he needs to go and try to like get one of these women, and that one of these women are possibly looking at Jonathan. Jonathan's like, no, like she isn't actually looking at me. She's probably looking at you. So we end up having Wyatt asking Jonathan when was the last time he had gotten to be with anybody. SEX wise. We have it to where Jonathan ends up mentioning like four times, and we end up having Wyatt saying, "Yeah, sure, okay, right, four, yeah, sure." So we end up going on, and so we have Jonathan who is now with Wyatt's phone, and so we end up having eventually Jonathan who is to go on and get a phone call to ask him if he is free tonight. That is, of course, a Wall Street analyst that is calling him and asking him this. This girl, a lot of people will probably know her from a number of things. More notably, they'll probably know her from a movie called Species. But she's also done a ton of other things besides that. Like a ton of also like sci-fi made for TV films. She's also been just kind of like in a number of other things, but uh, like I think I remember seeing her in I think the Black Room. I know it's like reviewed on the channel, so go ahead and check that out. So we end up having Jonathan who ends up going with this girl to this hotel, and we end up having them doing the bedroom business. And so we end up eventually Wyatt getting a hold of Jonathan, and Jonathan is confirming with Wyatt like, what was that? Like what? Like it just seems like this girl didn't really know who I was and whatever, and but we still just had a good time anyways. And so We end up having it to where Wyatt is like, well, hey, like I want to hear this whole entire story, but like not right now. I'm busy. So we end up having Jonathan, who ends up basically just going and running through like the entire phone. We eventually end up having Jonathan going and calling some woman who seems to actually know what is going on with this whole ordeal. So we end up having a Wall Street Belle who is Charlotte Rampling, and so we end up having her who is to basically tell Jonathan like the rules of everything. We end up having Jonathan coming into a bar of this hotel to mention to this Wall Street Belle, this Belle character, that he was late and that he is the man that she's looking for. So we end up having this Belle who is asking Jonathan, it's like, well, how is it that you don't know like all the rules? Because Jonathan did not know that he had to already have a room set up within this hotel. That he had to, since he was the initiator, he had to basically pay for everything. So we end up having it to eventually Jonathan is to go and have this Belle, who is on in some part of this movie, the cover of Forbes. We end up having this girl explain some of the rules to Jonathan, and I'm like, okay, so finally there's someone who actually cares. Plus, this girl actually likes bashful guys, and so, uh, like, this guy has been doing this already, but it seems that this woman is just kind of like we have it to where Jonathan is kind of the early stages of this. So we end up having Jonathan who ends up having the rules like told to him by this girl, this woman, and so we end up having Jonathan who is to after this starting to understand some of the rules and what he's supposed to do because it seems that Wyatt was just kind of feeding Jonathan this list but didn't tell him anything afterwards, so he had to figure out what the rules were from this girl. And so eventually we end up having eventually Jonathan who ends up going through this montage of basically running through all these women through this phone call to where eventually we end up having woman kind of double looking at Jonathan as a much more confident person. uh, we end up eventually having it to where Jonathan continues to eventually go and see some of these women. And so he eventually asks the Belle woman, like, why exactly does she do this? And we have her mention it's like, well, I do this because of the convenience of it. Because reasonably, the only time that she has ever gone out to have a dinner that wasn't business was like a year ago. And so she's kind of doing it just because she's lonely, just because it seems that she just doesn't have the time for a relationship, and so she'll probably just never have the time for it, which is kind of sad. So we go on and we end up having Jonathan kind of run through all these women, and eventually we get to the point where Jonathan eventually finds that same girl that he ended up seeing before on uh, the subway. So we end up having it to eventually Jonathan is to meet the girl on the subway, and it was also kind of funny when eventually Wyatt is to eventually call uh, Jonathan at one point and say like, "Hey, are you free tonight?" Knowing full well that Wyatt has been doing the same kind of thing that Jonathan is doing. So like we have it to where like Wyatt is just doing it as a joke. So we go on and we end up having Jonathan, who is to eventually meet the woman on the subway, and we end up having it to a reasonably. Uh, this woman is starting to like take off her clothes, and we end up having Jonathan who's like, you know what? Like, I have seen you before. I've seen you on the subway before. Like, this is kind of weird that I've kind of like seen you before this point in time. And we end up having it to where, well, the girl is like, well, like, should we reschedule this then? Should we like call this off? Like, because you've seen me before, like in public before this moment. And so we end up having Jonathan who's like, well, like, can we like go out to like get something to eat or something? Could we like go and uh, like, could we go out somewhere? And so eventually they just don't have like sex together. They just fall asleep, and eventually we have them eventually call one another again, and they go out for dinner at some Japanese or Chinese restaurant where uh, the woman does not know like what exactly she's ordering, but she's just kind of ordering whatever. So we eventually have it to where they exchange presents. She gives him a scarf, and he gives her some kind of duck toy that kind of just winds up. So we eventually have it towards seems that Jonathan and this woman are seemingly kind of getting to the point where it seems that they're more interested in one another besides just love making. And so we end up having bizarrely like this woman is to call Jonathan Frank, and so we end up having it to where Jonathan is to try to figure out what this girl's name is. And so he ends up kind of figuring out it's like, well, based off the fact that on her purse, uh, she had an S keychain on her purse, and so her name has to start with an S. And so we end up having it to where really Jonathan is coming up with any kind of S name like Sue, Susan, and so on and so forth. And at one point, we end up having him call her Sunbeam. He's like, "Do I really look like a sunbeam?" And he's like, I don't know. It could work out." Um, so we eventually have it to where they are to, because I guess they can't give one another names through here. Like a lot of this just has to be like privacy and secrecy and whatever. And so we end up finding that out, I guess, especially in the early goings of this movie, that eventually once uh, Jonathan is to call the first woman up, he ends up mentioning a name, and the other woman like mentions that she didn't hear that because she didn't want to hear that because it's the secrecy of it all. So we go along, and so we end up having really just Jonathan and this S girl just uh, reasonably just uh, having just a date to where the second time around we end up having S who is to basically tell Jonathan that she does not want to complicate his life, to where Jonathan is like, no, I will take all the complications that you have. And so we end up having eventually that Jonathan and S are going back to their room, and we end up having Jonathan who is trying to get ice. And so when he ends up going back into the room, he ends up getting knocked out by some assailant, and we end up finding out that S is now gone. Uh, Jonathan, there is for Jonathan there is some blood in the room, and so he ends up calling the police because S is gone, and so we end up having it to where Jonathan is mentioning and filling out a report about a missing persons where like he wasn't like he didn't know who she actually was, so he kind of like describes um this woman to the police officers, and eventually we end up having the police officers mention it's like, well, the guy at the counter of this hotel only saw you. He didn't see the woman that you were with. And also, like, where is this woman? Like, why is she gone? And so on and so forth. So we eventually have it to where after this whole thing is done, we end up having eventually Jonathan trying to call Wyatt, and he's having a hard time trying to get a hold of him. We end up having Jonathan, who ends up going to seemingly some of Wyatt's coworkers that he thought were their friends, and they actually weren't. We end up having eventually Jonathan, who ends up going to what he thought was Wyatt's apartment room, and it isn't. It isn't his apartment room. So we go on to this rabbit hole of Jonathan realizing that Wyatt was not real all along. So we eventually have it to where we finally have it to where Wyatt is to go on to eventually call Jonathan. And we end up having Jonathan basically, or Wyatt basically threatened to Jonathan that, like, hey, like, everything led up to here was foreplay, but now you're going to get effed. To where we really have it to where Jonathan is starting a new business at some place. And so we end up having Wyatt, who is telling Jonathan that he needs to go and uh, siphon off a bunch of money from this company because it'll be dirty money anyways. And so transferring this account to a account for Wyatt for him to be able to take this money out and try to run out of town with it. It's gonna be a huge sum of money. It's gonna be like I think $10 million. So we end up having to eventually Wyatt is to also show Jonathan a camera of uh, S being tied up, and so we end up having it to where uh, there's proof of life there, and so we end up having Jonathan, who's like, well, I guess I should like go and try to do what Wyatt says. So we end up having Jonathan, who is to uh, try to eventually do some research, and so we end up eventually having it to where Jonathan also gets a phone call from, I guess, one of Wyatt's old friends that ended up giving him this sex list of women to call. So we end up having Jonathan going to this woman, and I guess it's severely convenient that this woman ended up calling him. So we end up having Jonathan, who ends up going to this woman's home, and we end up having this woman who was like, well, you're not you're not the guy I called. Like, sorry, but you had the wrong number. And Jonathan's like, no, uh like I'm here for Wyatt Bowes, right? Like, Wyatt Bowes is the guy that you talked to. And she's like, no, I don't know any Wyatt Bowes. And so we end up having it to her like Wyatt Bowes is the guy that you called. All this chase round and around we go to eventually have this woman decide, like, yeah, you must have been uh, you must have gotten this phone from this guy who says he's Wyatt Bowes, but actually his real name is actually Jamie Getz. And so we end up having this woman who ends up mentioning how the SEX was so good that you probably kill somebody over it. And so she probably knew that Wyatt or Jamie was really just the wrong guy, but like she couldn't like stop what they had between one another. So we end up having to eventually Jonathan is to try and get a search results uh, on Jamie Getz, and of course he does. He gets photos, and then he goes on to call Wyatt and say, "Hey, um, I want Sarah, or I want this S girl. I want her now. Like, give her to me now, and then we'll call this done. We'll call this over. And we end up having Wyatt who's like, well, why should I give her up to you? And we end up having Jonathan is like, because I know your real name. I know that you're Jamie Getz. And so we end up having to her eventually, since Wyatt is basically like Jonathan knows all his little secrets. We end up eventually having Jonathan, or we end up having Wyatt, who ends up going and killing one of Jonathan's women that he had been with. And it seems like the description of this woman looked just like S. And so we end up having Jonathan, who ends up going down to the morgue to eventually reveal that it was the very first woman that Jonathan ever slept with. So we end up having Jonathan ask what the name of this girl was, and it was Simone, but it was a uh, completely different woman. I guess it could have led with Simone, but I guess that was kind of a little bit of, I don't know, secret, whatever, and what have you. So we end up having Wyatt eventually telling Jonathan, it's like, that's what I could do. Like, if you keep pushing me and whatever, like, I could kill all any kind of women that you have ever slept with to make you feel horrible about this, to make you feel like you were probably maybe quite possibly tied to any of these murders. Because uh, we end up having to where it seems that Wyatt has the guitar, um, tennis racket string uh, that he had killed her with, and so we end up having uh, the weapon that Jonathan has technically in Wyatt's hands, um, to really go and kill other people with, and to basically just point it at Jonathan eventually when things get a little too hot. So we end up having Jonathan who ends up going forcibly through this audit and eventually goes and transfers the funds and eventually has some guy watching over him to where he's like, well, hey man, it's not a specter sport or a spectorial sport. And so the guy ends up walking off. So we end up having eventually Jonathan who's going and transferring the funds. Everything works out well. And so we end up having Jonathan who ends up going up to or we end up having Wyatt who ends up going to Jonathan's room and triggering there to be an explosion uh, in Jonathan's room. Um, and now we end up having Wyatt who is now dressing as Jonathan and basically trying to be Jonathan. So we end up eventually having Wyatt waiting until Jonathan is to come home. And so we end up seeing a door open and a room explode. And so we are to assume that Jonathan is dead. So we have it to where Wyatt is to basically pay off S $1 million for what she is doing. It seems that Wyatt has mentioned that it seems that Jonathan was in love with S, and so S is starting to feel guilty about what all she has done. But eventually, we end up having Wyatt eventually going and being romantic with S, to where or immediately seeing that it's just like, well, uh, like S should just completely forget about Jonathan because he's dead. So we end up having Wyatt, who is now Jonathan, and now I'm just going to call him that for the rest of this point up until the very end here. So we end up having new Jonathan go on to a plane to go and get an account to go and get this money. So we end up having S, who is to follow new Jonathan to this bank. And so we end up having it to where Jonathan ends up going into this bank, has ID and all kinds of things, and so we end up having to eventually the bank guy is to tell Jonathan, well, I'm sorry, but you cannot sign this out because unfortunately you actually need two different signatures. And Jonathan says, like, well, what's the second signature? And the guy says, well, from a man named Wyatt Bowes. It's like, oh crap. It's like, well, I can't come in here as two different people. And so we end up having Jonathan who's like, ah, crap. Like, I'm not going to be able to get this money now. And so we end up seeing that Jonathan is still alive. And now Jonathan is now Wyatt Bowes. So again, I'm going to be switching the whole entire time. Now saying that uh, that first Jonathan is now new Wyatt Bowes. So the whole entire time I'll say like new Wyatt or whatever. So that way we don't get confused. So we have new Wyatt who is coming to Jonathan and saying like, yeah, like I figured your whole scheme out because in the photo that was taken of S, the photo was taken before the pipe had leaked, and so obviously that photo wasn't taken recently, and so that's how Wyatt figured out Jonathan. So we end up having also that Jonathan or that Wyatt wasn't the one who ended up opening his door to die. It was actually Wyatt's repairman that ended up coming to fix that pipe instead, and that's how the explosion went off. So we have it to where eventually that that Wyatt is basically telling Jonathan, "Hey man, you know what? Like I actually really worked for that money, and so you know what? I think that I should actually get half of that money." And to where Jonathan is like, "Well, okay, like sure, like fine, like you'll take this money. I don't care. Like 10 million, like basically." Like 10 or 20 million split in half, like it's a good chunk of change, anyways. So we end up having them both going through it, both signing it, and so after they end up signing it, we end up having Jonathan who's telling Wyatt, like, well, you know what? I think S is probably worth a lot more than you're willing to admit. Because we end up having Jonathan realizing that Wyatt really does love S and will do anything for her. So we end up having Jonathan who ends up pulling a gun on Wyatt to basically say it's like, well, maybe I should get like pretty much all of your money for S. And so we end up having eventually Jonathan is to eventually get shot uh, repetitiously to where we are to find out that Wyatt is looking at S, who had now shot Jonathan. And so we end up having Wyatt, who ends up just going and giving all the money to Jonathan and just walking off. Like he wasn't there for the money or Jonathan or anything. Wyatt was just there to get S back, and that's all that he wanted. So eventually, we end up having Wyatt who ends up scrambling to get S and to like say that basically all of what they're doing wasn't a lie, wasn't an act, wasn't a fabrication, that they really do feel for one another. And so we end up eventually having S who's like, well, yeah, like that was great and all, but eventually we end up having it to where eventually S is to leave and go and change her clothes, and we end up having Wyatt who ends up leaving and going into changing his clothes. And so we end up having both S and both Wyatt who end up meeting back together with one another, and they basically just start over. And so we end up having both of them just starting over, and eventually both of them ending up just getting together and just going with their relationship. And that's the way that this movie ends. So, yeah, with that said, I like this movie. It's kind of a fun film for me to just kind of enjoy, just because really the how there just seems to be more than just SEX involved with this movie. There's also just Hugh Jackman being a villainous person, and how rarely do you see that in films. So, with that said, I think I am going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.